So most of what we're going to do today is not like emitting little objects. We're going to be looking at ways of emitting strands or hair. But one thing you can do with just regular particles, so like if I just have a typical particle system and it's dropping particles, I could turn the gravity down in field weights, and I'm going to add just like a force field of turbulence and make it kind of strong, like 10, and make it kind of big. So we have all these particles going all these different places. Let me increase the lifetime of the particle to like 200. And we can actually visualize these as hair. This isn't really what you'd want to do if you wanted to make hair, but it's a pretty cool thing. So down here in render, we have like halo line. You can set it to an object, but if you say path, we don't see anything until you actually bake it. And baking is just letting Blender turn this light red thing to a dark red thing. It's just going to calculate it all for us. And I'm going to just set the end frames to like 120 before I bake, just so it bakes a little quicker. And I'm going to go to frame 1 and hit bake. So now this is the path that those particles traveled, which looks pretty cool and gnarly, I think. They're kind of like jagged edges. You can kind of see like this right here is quite a sharp edge. So in display, if you want to smooth that a bit, you can up the steps, and it starts smoothing it out. So what can you do with this? Well, with this, let's see, with this set of particles selected, let's see, it is selected. You just can't tell the ball is selected. See, it's selected. You can say Alt-C, and well, first we have to convert the particles. And now I'm going to move these to another layer just for a second. Here is our simulation on layer 1. Here is the converted thing, and these are actually vertices and edges. If I tab into edit mode, you can see it all. But what you could do is convert those to a curve with Alt-C, and we're going to convert to curve from a mesh. So it was technically a mesh. Now this is a set of curves. We can see those like little directional lines. And with that, if you go into the curve settings, you can give it depth. And right now, it's only giving it. Let's see if I can see. It's only giving it like half depth, so it's like the half of a square. So if we fill it to full, we're getting full depth. And if we're not doing extrude, we're doing bevel. And if we add to the resolution, we have like crazy spaghetti stuff. Let's go to sun. I'm going to go to cycles render, and so right off the bat we're getting some interesting looking stuff. I'm not sure if my computer can handle it now, but these curves can also be like simulated if you add soft body, and maybe I should turn the well, let's just see what happens. I think I'm just going to make a plane and give it like a collision physics thing setting, and then like those curves can have some physics. I think my computer will not enjoy doing this simulation. So technically it's simulating now, and what would happen if we waited long enough is this spaghetti strand will like flop onto this surface. It is it's very slow. So if you wanted to speed it up, what you need to do is have less particles before you bake, and have the display setting maybe set down to 2 or 3, because right now there's 1,000 of these lines and their display setting was set up quite high. But that is something to play with. So what you can also do for hair is just when you go into particles, you just, instead of having it set to emitter, you have it set to hair. And it automatically generates some hair for you. And let's just see what it looks like when you go into rendered. So a couple things. When you turn on hair, like you can't choose whether you want it coming out of the faces or the vertices. And in fact, you lose a lot of settings until you check advanced. And so by default, I always just turn on advanced. If you don't do that, you might find yourself in a situation where you're looking for a setting and you're like, where is it? So it's probably within that advanced tab. And now I can set the vertices coming from the hair. I can have it coming, you know, starting from the volume. And when it starts from faces or vertices, you kind of get the same length. But if you want to vary it a bit, if it starts from different points of the volume, you're going to get some different varying lengths without having to change any settings. Here's hair length, you know, the number of hairs. But what you can do with hair and particles too is once you have some stuff, you can go into particle edit mode. And down here, you know, we're just looking at edges. Here is what I like to do. You see some, like you see an edge and dots. So we're looking at the actual like steps of each particle. And here is just the end point. But you can like comb the hair if you wanted. So you have a brush. F will like basically feather out the radius of your brush. And Shift F lets you feather out the strength. So if I move this to 1, it's like a super strong brush. If I pull that out to like 0.2, it's like not a very strong brush. So you can like give your whatever model some weird looking hair. Now if you want, let's switch this to an area lamp. So like if you want to give your hair a material, here's how you do that. I'm just gonna increase the size of this. So by default, the hair is looking like kind of like hair. It's maybe a little thicker than you would normally do, but if it's thicker, you don't need to have as many particles, which is nice. So in our material, we can create a material and call it like skin, and then make another material and call it hair. And there's a hair in the version of Blender we're using. There's a hair BSDF shader, which has already been updated. You can download new versions of this Blender, and they use a hair shader that was basically modeled after the hair shader in Zootopia, and I'll show you that in a second. So, but anyways, we have two materials, and if we go to our particle setting now and go into render, right now the render is saying, well, what material should I use for these hairs? So I can set it to hair. And let's give that hair some color, like brown or something. And now we have some hair. And it looks like hideous, but that's... So if you want to, like, the thing about particle edit mode, once you start editing particles, if you want to like change your settings, you have to free edit, and you're going to lose all your changes to the combing. So really you want to get your settings kind of close before you start editing. So what I typically do, and let's see if this works, is like I just create like 3 particles, right? So I can kind of see what I'm doing. And one of the cool things you can do with hair or an emitter is there's something called children. And if I click, if there's no children, there's just those 3. But if I add simple, every one of those ones will get a child of itself. And right now we're only seeing the display of 10, but when I render it, each one will have 100 connected to it. So that's quite a bit. I mean, like, let's just set our display up to 100. Like, I mean, in a way, that's pretty cool. So the difference between simple and interpolated is if you have, let's say you have 2 hairs, one hair's like this and one hair's like that. Simple will just make 10 that go like this. Let's pretend that's 10, and then all of a sudden it'll switch to that. But interpolated would kind of interpolate between the 2 hairs. So if you have one hair here and one hair here, it'll start to gradually like bend the hair. So they just give you different results. Like this one is a smoother transition, as you can see. Like it's interpolating between the hairs. For the example I want to show you guys, I think this is pretty cool. So I have simple on, and we have a ton of hairs, and I just have 3 things emitting from this, but it looks like a lot. And we can add, like, we can make it curl. And let's see, I'm just gonna like up the frequency and the shape. Let's see. You might have to turn up in the display the steps a bit. So like, let's say we're getting some, and I'm just adding, like, basically in the children, I'm just like playing with values, but they kind of make sense if you just like mess around with the slider. What's nice about only using 3 hairs is you can kind of see what each value is doing. So I'm gonna like clump it a little bit, maybe like round it a little bit. Don't want to increase the radius too much. Okay, so like we have some kind of cool looking hair, right? You could even try like a braid and maybe. Okay, so all we're doing is just getting like, what do we want some of this hair to look like? And now I'm going to set this to 0. And if I go to particle edit mode, open up your toolbar, and I'm going to go to add. And I'm just going to, for every time I click, I'm going to add a count of 1. Okay, and sometimes this happens. So let's just quickly, I must have hit a setting that it wasn't happy with, so I'm just going to quickly add this, add a new, set this to like 3, give it some children, make it curly, up the steps, and okay. And maybe decrease the length. Yeah, I'm not sure what step I did that sometimes makes it not work. Who knows? It could be adding material. If you guys figure it out, let me know. So now I have my count set to 1, and let's say I want like 10 of those curls or whatever. I'm going to put them there, and then like maybe I could comb them with a really strong brush, or let's not do that much. But now when I hop back into object mode, it took those curls, let's give it a material, like for every one of those things I added and combed, it added those 100 children to it, and it combed them as well. So let's give it this and a new hair. Let's make it like, I don't know, black hair or something. So like that's, I mean, it's pretty decent for the little amount of work we put into it. At the bottom, at the very bottom, if you wanted to like really push your computer to the limit, like right now our thickness is at 1. So if you set that to 0.05, let's see if, like all of a sudden we're getting much, you know, it's much thinner, frizzier hair. So you would need to like up the particles by 10 if you wanted to, or up the children even. Let's see if you can do that. So let's say 200. So anyways, I think leaving it on the default settings to begin with is fine. And just having your children be at 100. And let me just save this real quick. And then I'm going to open up here. I'm going to open up a version of Blender you can download. If you go to blender.org and go to the Downloads tab, there's something called Experimental Builds. And it's really not an experimental build. They just, they're working on like a version of Blender called Blender 2.8. And so any Blender 2.79, like A, B, or C, like they're no longer making official releases for it. So this is like pretty much what people are using if you're really into Blender, is this kind of experimental build. Let me close this. There we go. But it looks the exact same. There's just some extra features that aren't in the Blender that we have. So if you wanted to do this at home, you could like just install this. Yeah. So it looks the exact same. Let me open hair test, and let's go to material, and now we have this principled hair BSDF. And let me give it some more dramatic lighting. So okay. When you're previewing hair, instead of having it to a sphere, you can switch to this particle thing, and then you can see previews of particles. So what I think is cool is this melanin concentration. So I'm in the principled hair. I'm going to switch that to melanin, and then it's like, oh, we have to set the particles and render to be that. So if you decrease the melanin, you get blonder hair. If you increase it, you get darker hair. The melanin redness, apparently hair can have redness in it. So like, let's say you want to take the redness out. You just drop that to 0, I guess, if you want. And the roughness, so like if you want really wet hair, you would turn that down to 0. If you want really rough hair. But anyways, that is something you can just play with on your own. So just create a sphere, and actually we might all be able to use a head that was modeled by Kira if you want. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is like, if you only want hair coming out of, like, let's say you get that head model, if you go to weight paint, and like we only want, I'm just using F to feather out the size. So like I only want hair from there. If you go to particles, new, hair, click advanced. And if you scroll down to vertex groups, you can set the density to be that weight paint we just added. So now we're only getting hair out the back. We can go to particle edit mode. We can like comb it. So yeah. So play around with that for a little bit, and then I'll show you some other cool things that you can do with hair.